everybody. Welcome to the BWC Online Bible Study. Today we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 12. As we look at Genesis chapter 12, we're going to look at the call of God on Abram's life. So we have learned about Noah. We learned about them, getting off the boat, and then God told everyone to separate and spread out and replenish the earth. But instead, in their evil, thoughts, they were gonna not do what God said to do. They're gonna congregate, they're gonna build this tower, and God just put a stop to that. He changed all their languages where they couldn't communicate with each other, and he had them spread out just like he had told them to do in the first place. And then we start going through the line of the descendants that are coming down from the sons of Noah, and we get to Shem, who was, you remember Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And so Shem, from his descendants, is where we find Abram. So it went down and it listed kind of what all had happened to everyone. And then we get to this one guy, Abram. His father, they had taken off on a journey and they were headed to the land of Canaan. But they stopped in Haran and they settled there. And they never made it to where they were supposed to go. His father ended up dying in that land, and then you've got Abram there. His brother had died before, and so he and his wife Sarah, or Sarai was her name at the time. Their names hadn't been changed yet. It was Abram and Sarai, and they had not been able to have children, and so his nephew Lot, who his father had passed, his grandfather had passed, was kind of Abram kind of taking him, what it feels like to me when I read it, like he's taking him kind of like as his kid and loving him and bringing him along with him. And so that's how we end up where we are at the beginning of Genesis chapter 12 today, talking about Abram. And so Abram has this close relationship with God, and he worships the Lord and he listens to the Lord, and that's where we're going to pick up now. It says, the Lord had said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. And I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and I will make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. And I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. And all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. So this one faithful guy who had set his heart on the Lord, and God said, this is the one. I'm fixing to pour out my blessing on you. And he tells him that he's going to make him into a great nation. Well, remember, up to this point, he and his wife have not been able to conceive a child. And so he's telling him that he's going to set these things right. He's going to make this happen for them. And so that's going to take some faith, because you don't see it happening in front of you right now. Your circumstances tell you otherwise. Things going on tell you otherwise. But when the Lord has spoken it to you, you can trust him. And so he's pouring out this blessing on Abram, and he tells him that all the families of the earth will be blessed through you. And so this is something that's even prophetic for us, that we need to grab hold of in this moment, because he is going to be the father, really, of the nation of Israel. And so these are going to be his people who are going to be blessed. And God's going to put his blessing on them, but it's not just for them, through them. When Jesus comes to redeem and restore, he doesn't just come for the nation of Israel. When the Messiah comes, he came to redeem and restore everyone who will turn their heart toward him. Jesus has died on the cross to take away your sins. And this is where we're seeing that, he spoke about it in the Garden of Eden when he picked up the snake, and he told him that he would bruise his head and he would bruise his heel. And so he was talking about that Jesus was going to crush the head of Satan, and that Satan was going to bruise the heel of Jesus. And we see that as Jesus died on the cross. And here again, he's beginning to show us how he's going to make this happen, and it's going to be through Abraham, through Abram, through the nation of Israel, the Messiah was going to come to redeem and restore and bring us back into right relationship with God that had been broken in the garden. And so it says, so Abram departed as the Lord had instructed. There's a lot in that one verse right there. You know, how many times do we sit in a church service and do we listen to the message and God is like speaking these words to our heart and we know that it's for us. And then we get up from the chair. I mean, maybe, you know, the guys not as much, but the girls, like the makeup's down the face and the tears in the eyes and all the emotion that you feel in that moment when you know God's talking to your heart. And guys, you know, like I've watched, you know, I preached a message one time, and you know, when you're talking, you're looking out to the crowd and you're trying to read people, see if they're receiving what you're giving to them. And I was speaking this message, one of the first messages I had ever gotten up and really spoken in front of people. And this one guy that I really respect has got his head down and he's like this, and I'm thinking, gosh, like this just sucks. And he's so disappointed in me. And I'm just like I'm not doing a good job. I thought I wasn't doing a good job. And I'm thinking about myself in this moment. And we get through and he wasn't mad or angry or disappointed in the words I was saying. God was convicting his heart in that moment and speaking to him about something that he was going through. And so you know, it looks different on your face as a girl and a guy, but it's the same thing in the heart. Like God is just touching your heart with something, and you're sitting there in the chair, but how easy is it to get up from that chair, to have felt the feelings and then not do anything about it, not follow where the God's telling you to go, not do what God's telling you to do, not listen to that burning, that instruction, that, you know, direction. You know, sometimes it's not that he's giving you a direction, it's that he's wanting you to stop doing something or start doing something, or even just recognize that he's fixing to start working on something in your life. And so but Abram did what God told him to do. He got out from where he was and he gets back on that journey. They had settled in Haran. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was to get to Canaan. And so the family, you know, for the rest of his father's life, they just sat down. But then God's telling Abram, get back up. We're fixing to finish this trip. And it says Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. And he took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household in Haran, and he headed for the land of Canaan. And they arrived in Canaan. Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem, and there he set up camp in the oak of Moreh. And at that time, the area was inhabited by the Canaanites. So, you know, the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. And this land's like officially like belonged to these other people because they were there first. But God said, no, I'm giving this to you. And so it is that we see that the earth really is the Lord's, and he will make a way, but we've got to be willing to trust him in the middle of it. And so it says, then the Lord appeared to Abram and he said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord who had appeared to him. After that, Abram traveled south to set up camp in the hill country in Bethel and went west into Ai. And there he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord, and he worshiped the Lord. And then Abram continued traveling south by stages toward the Negev. He built an altar and he dedicated it to the Lord. The Lord was promising him something, and Abram was worshiping God in the middle of it. He hadn't received it yet. He's just walking through this land. You know, my husband and I went and walked through some land the other day, and it's like, it made me think about this with Abram, like what it was like when he's walking through this place, and you know, God is really just speaking to his heart in the middle of that moment, and just blessing him for being obedient. And so then it says Abram and Sarai in Egypt. At the time, there was a severe famine that struck the land of Egypt, forcing Abram to go down to Egypt and live as a foreigner. I forgot to mention something that I had learned about earlier, so I'm going to back up just a little bit. And it's talking about where he pitched the tent. and there he set up camp in Morah. One of the Hebrew words where it's talking about he had pitched the tent, um, it says it in a feminine term. And so it's like he pitched her tent. And so it was that he had his heart toward his wife, like he's setting up her tent first. And so they lived together, but they had things, and so she had a tent, probably he had a tent. And so when I was reading and studying about that, it made me laugh a little bit, like the first she shed, she had her place. But really that his heart was showing favor toward her, and that he was loving on her and setting up her place first. And so it says, at that time a severe famine had struck in the land of Canaan, forcing Abram to go to Egypt and live there as a foreigner. And so as he was approaching the border of Egypt, Abram said to his wife Sarai, "Look, you are a very beautiful woman. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife. Let's kill him so then we can have her. So please tell them that you are my sister, and then they will spare my life and treat me well because because of their interest in you.'" So this starts to get a little sketchy. Like, this is the man of God who's shown this favor toward his wife, and now all of a sudden he's like, "Look, like, I'm just going to pretend like you're my sister, and then they can have you, and then I'll be blessed." And as I'm reading this, I'm thinking, geez, like that's terrible. Yeah, that's really bad. But one of the Bible commentaries that I was listening to was talking about that this possibly could have been a prophetic thing. But then when you read the commentary in my study Bible, when it says, "Say you are my sister," it says Abram failed to trust God in this situation. His attempt to deceive the Egyptians led to embarrassment when he was asked to leave the country. These verses show how important honesty is for God's people. Although Abram repented, he could not keep his moral failure from being hidden. Abram's bad example should challenge us as believers to keep trusting in God regardless of the circumstances. His example should be to encourage us to see how God can bring us back into his will even after we have failed him. And that's just, whether you take it as it was prophetic and he needed to do this, God was saving his life through this, or you take it this way, which is more where I am tending to lead toward, because we see later on there are times when Abram is trying to kind of like figure out a plan on his own. He's going where God's telling him to go, but then when things are looking a little bit sketchy, it's like he gets nervous and kind of does it his own way. And so we can learn from that either way. It's like we need to trust God in the middle of where we are. And if God had promised him all of these nations and promised him all of these things, then he was going to follow through and take care of Abram. And he really does, because the king could have gotten mad in the situation and killed him, and he didn't. But we see later on that there are going to be times in Abram's life when he kind of goes his own way because he's not sure how God's really going to handle it for him. But then in the end, when we get to where Abram is really challenged like the most in his faith in his old age, after all of these things have happened, and he sees and knows God is who he says he is, that he was really willing to obey to the bitter end. And we'll get to all that later on as we go through the story. Now, if you've read the Bible already, you know all about Abram and Isaac and the things that are going to come. But as you see his faith growing in these moments, he's trusts God enough to leave and go where he's supposed to go, but doesn't feel like he can trust God enough to protect him when he steps into this land with his beautiful wife. But we're going to see that even in this decision that he's made, to try to protect himself, that God's still going to show himself in the middle of that moment. It says, "And sure enough, when Abram arrived in Egypt, everyone noticed Sarah's beauty, and the palace officials saw her, and they sang praises to the Pharaoh, their king, and Sarai was taken into his palace. Pharaoh gave Abram many gifts because of her: sheep, goats, cattle, male and female donkeys, male and female servants, and camels. But the Lord sent a terrible plague upon Pharaoh and his household because of Sarai, Abram's wife. So some of the things that we can see in the middle of this is the value that God places on marriage, the value that God had this plan that He has for Abram and Sarai, and here they are like messing it up, and people are getting in between, and it's like God needed Abram to trust Him, and He needed Sarai to be His wife and to be there with Him, and so just earlier in the previous chapter, He's going to bless those who bless you. He's going to curse those who curse you. And even though Pharaoh had given him like physical material things, he was taking his wife away from him. And I even heard some commentary about, that Abram, lies in the middle of that moment. Well, actually back then, before there were enough people in the world, there weren't rules and laws about like intermarrying, and there weren't enough people for that to have been an issue. And then there's stuff with DNA where it gets weird now because of the DNA, but back then you could marry somebody from your father's house, and so it was that Sarai was actually his sister, and in a disconnected way, but so he wasn't lying, but he also wasn't telling the truth. Have you ever been caught in one of those situations where it's like you're not really lying, but you're not really telling the whole truth? And then God gets Himself in the middle of that situation, and He sends the terrible plagues on the household. And so the Pharaoh summoned Abraham and accused him sharply. "What have you done to me?" he demanded. "Why didn't you tell me that she was your wife?" Because if he would have known that, he probably wouldn't have taken her into his own house. Why did you say she is my sister and why did you say she is my sister and allow me to take her as my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and get out of here. Pharaoh ordered some of his men to escort them, and he sent Abram out of the country along with his wife and all of his possessions. And so we see that he sent him away because of the curse that had come on him, because of the things that had happened to him, because he was not, even though he was giving him stuff, he was not actually blessing Abraham by taking his wife away from him. And Abram hadn't been honest in that moment, and so here he is needing to be somewhere, and God just or not God, but Pharaoh just kicks him out of the country. And so, like, what's the takeaway here? What is it that we've learned from this Genesis chapter 12? That God can put a call on your life, that things aren't always simple, that sometimes they're really difficult. Sometimes we get afraid in the middle of that. Marriage can have a lot of ups and downs. Here he is 1 minute, like she's his one and only love, and he's putting up her tent first and all of this, and then all of a sudden he's ready to like give her away so that he can save himself. so a lot of ups and downs in the marriage, but when you put God in the middle of it, that He can help to make things right, that He can be the blessing in the middle of that He can even be a protector of that marriage. And so that's what I'm going to leave you guys with today, Genesis chapter 12, and I will catch you back again in Genesis chapter 13.